deeper we go into the semester, the closer we are to the end, but equally the more precious these event slots become. And so, for those of you that are just joining us, there's plenty of space over here. We also have the front row is available. It's so bold. And so, you know, a crowd like this in February signifies one thing, but a crowd like this in April or May signifies something else. Please join us tomorrow evening in Piper at 6:30 for our Kylie lecture by James Corner of Field Operations in the University of Pennsylvania. So tomorrow at 6:30, Piper. It's a great pleasure to be able to have an event around the reception of Projective Ecologies. Projective Ecologies is, among other things, a GSD publication that's been really the conception of and the labor of love of Chris Reed. Chris needs no introduction. You know Chris and his background. So what I wanted to spend a couple of moments on briefly is just talking about the genesis of the project. When I first started talking to the leadership of the school about joining 5 years ago, one of the questions I had near the top of my list of questions was, you happen to have in Stoss landscape urbanism one of the most vibrant, productive young practices in North America. And he's right here in town, and why is it that he flies weekly to Philadelphia? That seems self-evident in the context of a conversation about the school and where it's going. And so I was very pleased as a part of the group, the cohort that joined 5 years ago, that Chris was able to join us and is now assistant professor in practice of landscape architecture here in the school. As soon as we hit the ground, the cohort, we began conversations within the department about, well, what should the shape of this new particular moment in the school be? What forms might it take? Which topics might it stimulate? What are the kinds of discussions that we might want to partake in? And in that context, of course, this was right upon the heels of the reception of ecological urbanism, right? And in many quarters, I was having conversations about, well, what does it mean for a leading school of architecture to use ecology as an adjective? What does that mean? For those of us in landscape architecture, we've had a cultural history and a kind of habit of mind of thinking of ecology as ours. And at the same moment, in the course of the last decade, ecology has come to be what Christopher Hight describes as kind of epistemological framework. It's a body of knowledge that can be available for a range of disciplinary discourses, a range of practices, well outside of landscape. And so what does it mean for a design school in its initial repositioning to have a new administration frame ecological urbanism as a central framework for the reorganization of the school? What does that mean? And in our initial conversations as a faculty, as a department, it became clear to many of us that this was an interesting set of questions. It wasn't all sorted out, and that was immediately one of the places that we could begin to shed some light. What would we want to frame the question? What does it mean to have one group of people in this building and in these fields taking ecology to be a singular applied natural science, while at the very same moment, directly adjacent in the next room over, there's another group of people who are taking it as a general epistemological framework, a way of knowing the world, across disciplines, across campus. And in the next room over, there are others who could be using it as a model for design intervention. What does it mean that you have this framework working simultaneously in those three very different realms? And at the same moment, how might that more fully inform the aspirations of our department and our school, but also how might that more fully characterize the aspirations of ecological urbanism? And so it was in those conversations, Chris re-proposed doing an event in the first year. He said immediately we should do something that would be event organized, knowing that coursework and studios and practice and other modes of engagement take so much longer. The idea being that an event can be catalyzed very quickly, can be organized around a topic very quickly, and in so doing can immediately begin to impact discourse. I'm fairly sure that I don't think at that moment Chris thought it would take 4 years for the book to arrive.
4.5.
More about that in a moment. But I want to begin with the spring 2010 event, Critical Ecologies and its aspirations. And then point you to the co-editor, Nina Marie Lister, as you know, who's co-edited the book with Chris, is trained in ecology and in planning. She's appointed in planning at Ryerson University in Toronto. She's been a regular visitor here for us in the Department of Landscape Architecture over the last several years, teaching in the space between ecology and planning. And so in that respect, the book is very much the product of the intellectual efforts and the practical engagements of both Chris Reed and Nina Marie Lister. It is, of course, the work of many, many others, contributors, editors, the GSD team, both in events and in publications, and hopefully you'll say something more about that by way of acknowledgement. So I won't dwell on it, but I want to begin there with the idea that this is really the first opportunity as a department and as a school that we've had to put into print, into wide circulation in book form, something that came out of the recent reorganization of the department and the school. And in that regard, it's timely. I know that there are audiences that are eager to receive this project. And the last thing that I'll say before inviting people to join us here, there are plenty of chairs, please join us around the table, would be for me a little bit of, I think, where we are and how you might think about this in the first place. The first is the idea of ecology as plural, something that we've been talking about the last several years here in the department, here in the school. What does it mean? What's at stake to think about ecologies rather than ecology? And a part of that represents a disciplinary shift, the promiscuity of it being available to other fields. What does it mean for it to be available to other fields? Equally, I'm interested in what does it mean to articulate a point of tangency between those people that work as ecologists and those people that work as designers. Having articulated that there are separate ways of knowing the world, design and science, but knowing that this project proposes overlap and points of tangency. And among the clearest, most fecund, really most provocative arguments in that regard is the idea that I think Chris will touch on, in which he argues, among others, that designers and ecologists are both engaged in making models of the world. And that point of tangency, while it's not the only thing we share, for me is a point of enormous promise today. And at the same moment comes with a fair degree of anxiety, and if not tension. And so in that regard, I'm very pleased to see the book. Congratulations, thanks for doing this. Please join me in welcoming Chris Reed.
Thanks, Charles. Appreciate the introduction, appreciate the opportunity to share with you this work that's been somewhat consuming me and a number of other people for the last few years. Certainly appreciate you all showing up on what's easily the best day of the year so far. For those of you at the back, come on up, don't be shy. They're nice, comfy seats. You can lean on the table. Happy to have you. I do want to start with a few acknowledgments, though. As Charles alluded to, he's really been a huge supporter of the project from the start. And I really appreciate the support that you've given, the space that you've given us to really put these ideas on the table and to kind of take hold of this project as something that's central to the department. I certainly don't think we could have done this without you, so I really, really appreciate that support. I also want to acknowledge the support of Mosen and Pat Roberts, who have contributed resources, time, people, and and funding to help support not only the symposium project, but the book project as well. I also need to single out Melissa Vaughn, who's hiding back here. Melissa Vaughn, on the one hand, is one of the most agile, professional, wonderful copy editors that I've ever met in my life. And yet she also kind of took on the project as a kind of labor of love, particularly as I think we approved the final proofs only about 2 weeks ago. So I really appreciate, Melissa, the support that you've given to us, as well as the support coming from the communications office with Ben Krosky and Jennifer Siegel, and of course Chantel, who's here today helping us organize this event. Thanks. I need to single out, lastly, our research assistants. We've had a team of research assistants. The one that's worked hardest most recently is Christina Antiporta. I know she's going to be a few minutes late to this, but I just want you all to know the extraordinary efforts that she's made to the project with Difei Ma and Cooper-Hewitt helping her out at the end. And of course, thanks to the many contributors, a few of whom are in the room today. As Charles indicated, the project was really initiated with the conversation that he and I were having almost immediately on him walking in the door in 2009. And I posed the question to him, have we exhausted ecology's potential, critical potential, to continue to inform design and design thinking? Ecology by then was so central to design thinking and design practices that it was everywhere. What was a radical shift in thinking 30 years ago was now being taken for granted. Ideas of adaptive systems and successional landscapes were increasingly embedded within design proposals. Environmental sustainability was everywhere. Ecology was now becoming hip. And everything was ecology. And that was troubling to me. And it seemed to me at that moment that we needed to step back and simply assess, where are we with this project of ecology in relationship to design? And where might we be going? How do we critically evaluate this? How do we reset the gauge, dive deeper, or with a fuller and deeper understanding, simply move on? And so the project began as a colloquium in 2010, under the name of Critical Ecologies, and then became this book project with Nina Marie Lister joining the editorial team in 2010. The project itself, very briefly, looks at the various relationships between ecological research and design thinking, design practices, both looking back over the last 20, 25 years and also starting to project forward. The idea with the book was to first commission a series of essays on people who could help us assess and speculate on where this project's going. It included contributions from the folks in that middle column, which were reprints of essays that we considered seminal to the project and the thinking at hand. And it also took on a third dimension to it when Akhtar became involved, and we said we really need to look at the ways in which designers and ecologists project the world through their drawings. And so there's a whole third section of the book scattered through the book that really focuses on these drawings. Now, as you know, in the last 3 decades, the field of ecology has moved from a classical concern with stability, certainty, and order to more contemporary understandings of dynamic change and of the related phenomena of adaptability, resilience, and flexibility. You know, increasingly, these concepts of ecological thought were adapted as models or metaphors for cultural production broadly, and for the design arts in particular. And they were amplified across a range of design disciplines by prominent theorists and practitioners. Now, in this context, landscape architecture assumed a unique disciplinary and practical space, equally informed by ecological knowledge as an applied science, as a construct for managing change, and as a conceptual model of cultural production or design. Yet for many of us, ecology is not simply a project of the natural sciences, Many researchers, theorists, and social commentators have used ecology as a broader idea or metaphor for a set of conditions and relationships with political, economic, and social implications, or even redefined the term ecology to include these realms as broader context. Now, James Corner, with whom I studied in the 1990s, was among the first to claim ecology as a territory of ideas, as a territory for investigation. Ecology as agent for design and creativity. He did so through his writings, his teachings, and his practice, and he did so in expansive ways. Quoting him here, "The processes of which ecology and creativity speak are fundamental to the work of landscape architecture, whether biological or imaginative, evolutionary or metaphorical. Such processes are active, dynamic, and complex, each tending toward the increased differentiation, freedom, and richness of a diversely interactive whole." Now, he wasn't the only one. Felix Guattari, writing in The Three Ecologies, argues that ecology is as much bound up in issues of social and economic power, demographies, political struggles, and engagement, as it is operating in relationship to environmental forces. Rainer Lehnen talks of the combination of geography, climate, economics, demography, mechanics, and culture, made evident only via movement on the city's characteristic roads and freeways, that constitute four organizational ecologies for metropolitan Los Angeles. Kazis Farnalis refers to the networked ecologies of LA as a series, quote, of codependent systems of environmental mitigation, land use organization, communication, and service delivery. And it's really against this backdrop, then, that it was useful to take stock of the diversity of contemporary ecological research and theory. Where were ecological thinking and theory when we began this project? What do current trajectories of research suggest for future practice? How can advances in ecological research and modeling and social theory and in digital visualization inform with greater rigor more robust design thinking and practice? Now, why projective and why ecologies? Projective is both important and suggestive. It recognizes very much the constructed nature of ecologist models for the physical and dynamic aspects of the natural world. As Charles mentioned, it was Stuart Pickett who commented at the Critical Ecologies Symposium that in fact all ecologists have to work with are their conceptual models of ecosystems. They're not out there in the world actually changing the ecosystem itself. In other words, they use models as projective inventions. In this way, the term projective embraces the creative and speculative ambitions of representation, the drawings and models that scientists, designers, and others use to help illustrate ideas. And in many cases, it's through this work of modeling that ecological ideas have continued to emerge and are clarified. The second part of the title, Ecologies, is an explicit recognition of the plurality of ecological theories and applied research underpinning contemporary understandings of cultural and natural living systems. Now, just in the natural sciences, you think of landscape ecology, human ecology, urban ecology, applied ecology, evolutionary ecology, restoration ecology, deep ecology, the ecology of place, and the unified theory of ecology. These are but a few of the specialized areas of ecologically oriented research that have emerged over the past decades and continue to inform our thinking about various interrelationships between plants, animals, and the physical, biological, cultural, and experiential world in which we live. In this regard, this collective body of work is a recognition of a growing alignment between these ideas and contemporary theories about the complex and predictable and emergent nature of the world, a world which is increasingly recognized as a hybrid of culture and nature, where old dualisms are being supplanted by transdisciplinary thinking, uneasy synergies, complex networks, and surprising collaborations. Now, the first chapter of the book is co-authored with Nina Marie Lister, and it establishes the conceptual frameworks for the project. Here we identify three parallel genealogies in the natural sciences, in the humanities, and in design that inform our thinking and our work today. What I want to do is dive a little bit deeper into the content of that chapter, but also weave through it a discussion of the many contributors' works that populate the book. Starting with the natural sciences, the origins of ecosystem ecology began in the mid-50s with the work of the brothers Eugene Odum and Howard T. Odum, who were both zoologists by training. And together in 1953 published the first English language textbook on ecology called The Fundamentals of Ecology. Their work explored the various interrelationships between species, energy, and matter within ecosystems, and the various inputs and outputs that both shaped ecosystems, and also had reverberative effects on their wider environments. But it really took until the 60s for ecology to be truly considered a valid science, and this coincided with a rise in modern environmentalism that was in part fueled by Rachel Carson in her 1962 iconic work, Silent Spring. C.S. Holling and his contemporaries working in Western Canada were also important at this moment. Holling pioneered the notion of resilience and its implications for adaptive management practices. His 1970 essay, reprinted here, on the new ecology and large-scale resource management seeded new interest in the dynamism of the natural environment among non-scientific audiences, including designers and planners, and suggested new ways of working therein. I think it's quite interesting that already in 1970, as he's introducing a new idea of ecology, he's already tying this directly to climate practices. Richard Forman's research in the 70s and 80s is a key example of new direction in applied ecology. Forman, working here at the GSD, developed new understandings of new terminologies for ecological systems, which were now described as matrices, webs, and networks, and which were characterized by adjacencies, overlaps, and juxtapositions. His notational drawings of movements, interrelationships, and operations married an assessment of the physical landscape with its performance through time. Robert E. Cook's lecture and essay, Do Landscapes Learn, from the 1990s, drills deeper on the new paradigm and cites studies by David Foster at the Harvard Forest, among others, that demonstrate how disturbance and change were inherent to living systems. Talking directly to landscape and design audiences, Cook outlines the possibilities of using the new model of ecology as both mechanism and metaphor for design practices in landscape architecture. Now, even more contemporary work by Erle Ellis on new anthropogenic taxonomies for global bioregions, and by our colleague Peter Del Tredici on valuing the emergent and adaptive flora of cities, continues to press the ways in which we understand humans as caught up in and inextricably part of ecosystems in action. It's interesting, too, that such work and thinking has now been taken up by designers like David Fletcher, who writes for us about the emergent and accidental, and clearly human-influenced freakologies, he calls them, that have arisen from the overlapping and concentration of urban infrastructures along the Los Angeles River. Now, while scientists were making their preliminary work known through scientific journals and other discipline-specific media, a number of researchers in the humanities set themselves to work exploring what might be the social and cultural implications of this emerging research. These works, intended for audiences from a multiplicity of disciplines, took on this impulse to tie humans to nature, to deal with the implications of what it means to be inextricably linked to and part of the world around us. Now, Daniel Botkin was one of the first science writers to bring new ideas about ecosystem behavior to the humanities and to the popular press, to establish a bridge between the natural sciences and the humanities. His seminal 1990 work, Discordant Harmonies, told engaging stories about moose on an island in the Great Lakes, elephants in Kenya's vast landscape, or the old forests of New Jersey, stories that helped to overturn models of ecological stability based on evidence on the ground. Botkin also traced a succession of concepts about ecology and environment via the metaphors of divine order, organic comrade, the great machine, etc. Concepts that illustrated these ideas' cultural roots. Now, he posited against those a new, all-embracing yet situational model of what he called the dynamic biosphere. In this new model, humans are fully enmeshed in the forces and dynamics that influence climate and life on the planet. Yet the conditions that we may encounter on the ground are fleeting and momentary, caught up in cycles and dynamics which are ever-changing and somewhat just out of reach. Now, importantly, Botkin too argues that our management practices must adapt themselves, that principles of order, control, and limits will eventually doom the very things we want to protect and sustain. Others wondered aloud whether this was all there was. Many authors propose the idea that even if we're physically and biologically tied to the natural world, there's still something unknowable, uncontrollable, that is simply beyond the human capacity to comprehend or control. Among the most powerful efforts in this line is Robert Bogue Harrison's 1993 work, Forests, Shadow of Civilization, which documents many civilizations' attempts to both negotiate natural forces around them and to conceptualize their relationships with the natural world. Here he draws on the principles of the Italian drawing technique called chiaroscuro to demonstrate his thoughts. Chiaroscuro, of course, is this drawing technique in which a foreground element, in this case the tree, emerges visually from the background of the forest there via a series of light and dark marks that are developed in relationship to one another. Here, Bogue Harrison argues that it is really only in this dynamic relationship with the physical world that each of these, the tree, the forest, are made evident. In other words, the apparent contrast between humans and nature can only be delineated by a set of devices that are common to them, an inherent recognition that we can only talk about the natural world or ecology via a set of models that are intrinsically human. Everton's 1992, The Social Creation of Nature, is also insightful. Everton traces societal relationships between various global civilizations and the natural world, arguing that the simple act of naming nature was a first step in removing the physical world from the human world, an act of domestication that allowed humans to both sever and control. He argues for qualities as opposed to nameable things that might describe that which exists beyond human control. Wildness is not ours, he writes. Indeed, it's the one thing that can never be ours. It's self-willed, independent, and indifferent to our dictates and judgments. An entity with a quality of wildness is its own, and no other. Everton's entrenchment to set the world free in order to save it could only be heard within a scientific context that had recently dismissed stasis and control in favor of dynamism and open-endedness in natural systems. Sanford Kwinter extends these speculations in the architectural world in his 2008 essay, Wildness, Prolegomena to a New Urbanism. Here, Kwinter references a vicious attack on a jogger in Central Park and Viet Cong techniques in America's war with Vietnam as examples that somehow deal with entities that are uncontrolled or uncontrollable. He writes, "The wild is the logic of animal societies, of the inmixings and inadvertencies of the natural world, and of complex adaptive systems in general, even those of an entirely artificial kind." Kwinter calls for a redefinition of the design project and the broader project of urbanism in ways that exhibit or sustain essential characteristics of messiness, indirectness, openness, and indeterminacy. And in doing so, he's brought to a specifically architectural readership the same quest that others in the humanities had proposed in the preceding decade, but this time expressed in specifically architectural language. Now, all this has had clear impact on design thinking and practices. For me, in many ways, contemporary ideas of ecology and planning can be traced to the work of Ian McHarg in the late 60s and early 70s, in which the analysis and assessment of natural resources, geology, soils, water, habitat, etc., could inform the best places and ways to develop land for social occupation. McHarg's methodology gave quantitative value to resources and systems that had long been ignored in the formulation of development plans. France, and it was popularized by municipal and regional planners across the US and eventually around the world. McHarg's practice opened up planning thought to the idea of the interconnectedness between cities and suburbs on the one hand and the natural world designed with nature. But even as his methodology was taking hold, newer ideas about ecology were emerging and having immediate impact on designers' thinking. Richard Forman's work cited earlier importantly recognized the dynamic living nature of ecological systems, not just the physical stuff McHarg was mapping, but how the material of the physical world supports the movement and exchange of ecological matter, like water, seeds, and wildlife. Still others in the design disciplines push these ideas further. Rich Haig at the Blue Out Reserve in Washington both hyper-amplified woodland decay and composition in the moss garden and framed out groundwater fluctuation, a phenomenon that extended far beyond the garden or the reserve in the beautifully simple and abstract hedge garden. Both gardens were firmly rooted in landscape traditions, but gave new presence to those forces and dynamics that were beyond the control of the designer, and whose informants and implications reached to scales of influence much larger than the space of the particular project. The work of George Hargreaves and Hargreaves Associates and the work of the so-called earth artists who greatly informed that work extended this trajectory of design research. Candlestick Point Park on San Francisco Bay was among the early works of that firm that deliberately engaged open-ended environmental processes, and it did so more explicitly than Haig's work. Here, the bay edge of the project was armored where a top lawn touched the water, but this plain of grass gave way along its edges to an extension of the rocky intertidal zone of the bay, physically and spatially bringing the waters of the bay and its various offerings of floating logs and condoms and animal skeletons and plastic bottles and waste into the space of the park. While Haig's hedge garden was an inward-focused, carefully framed space with a simple plane of water that would register environmental cycles, Hargreaves' Candlestick project radically inverted this relationship, throwing open the space of the public park or garden and subjecting it to the forces of the bay. Now, these experiments and speculations were not isolated. Michael van Valkenburg's ice walls at Radcliffe College examined the freezing, thawing, and visual temporal effects of water in its multiple states. Rem Koolhaas and May's proposal for the Parc de la Villette included a linear forest conceived as a temporal garden that allowed the growth tendencies of two contrasting tree species to play off one another and create ever-changing vegetal and spatial effects. Most significantly, perhaps, the early work of Michel Devine and Christine Delroque set out strategies in which growth, succession, and careful editing of newly planted urban or industrial forests could be seen to reintroduce environmental dynamics into sites and projects that had erased or at least significantly dampened ecological effects. Now, the shift in ecological thinking and research and its counterparts in process-oriented design experiments opened new worlds for critical discourse in design and urbanism. Stan Allen identified the new ecology along with engineering systems as important examples of what he called material practices, which focus not so much on what things look like, but more so on what they can do. This was a significant moment. Allen's explicit reference to work with the landscape ecologies Forman, marrying the operative and the performative aspects of dynamic ecologies with emerging design theory, moved the discussion of complex adaptive systems out of the domain of environmentalism and landscape alone and into the center of design discourse and theory. Allen's continuing work in collaboration with James Corner and ecologist Nina Marie Lister in Toronto's Downsview Park competition imagined the setting up of physical scaffolds that would sponsor the propagation of emergent ecologies, natural systems that would be seeded initially and would evolve with an increasing level of complexity and adaptability over time. Even the competition brief here was significant in that it required entries to account for long-term timeframes and to make explicit some comfort with irreducible uncertainty in terms of project evolution. Now, since this time, a number of design practices have taken up these ideas, while others have adopted analogs of responsive systems to inform design thinking. Adaptive building systems or elements, fenestration systems that automatically respond to changing light levels, for instance, keeping building interiors cooler, are now widespread, propagated by designers and architects such as Chuck Hoberman, Foster and Partners, and many others. Ecological cyborgs, which hybridize infrastructural function and ecological responsiveness by diverting waste resources from industrial operations, are on the drawing tables of cross-disciplinary design practices like my own. Folks like Jane Wolff have been exploring the future implications of human and cultural settlements in rich dynamic environments with her work on the Sacramento Delta, recently published here on New Orleans. And longer-term management and curatorial strategies for large-scale open space infrastructure and urban projects now allow for feedback loops and multiple possible outcomes. Even the structure of multidisciplinary design teams and academic alliances have been affected. Now, beyond the tripart framework that we've outlined, Christopher Hight's contribution contextualizes and theorizes the project. As Charles noted, Hight claims ecology is one of the most important epistemological frameworks of our age. His essay, in many ways, is a call to arms. He writes, rather than understand ecology as a dominant and authoritative imposition that threatens the traditions of design disciplines, design becomes the nexus of mediation between the social, the subjective, and the ontological. Design becomes perhaps the central practice and way of thinking about our ecological condition and of intervening within it. Instead of adopting nature as a model, we need to urbanize ecology. In this vein, then, I want to come back to design thinking and design practices, and specifically to the projective. James Kwinter has long made the argument that drawing and representation are more constructive or speculative acts than they are representations of ideas already formed. And as I said before, the ecologist Stuart Pickett acknowledged that the activity common to both ecologists and designers is this projective act of making models of the worlds that we engage. And so part of the project was to collect and curate archival, prototypical, and contemporary images and drawings that explore the implications of emerging models for design. The drawings here are arranged in broad categories derived from definitions of specific ecological characteristics that both reflect and reinterpret central ideas within complex adaptive systems theory. These are scattered throughout the book, and then some of them are reproduced in the back in these nice foldouts that you can take home and hang above your bed. These, the introductions to these sections are really set up as a she said, he said. Nina Marie providing a kind of natural sciences definition of whatever the topic is, and me responding with a kind of reinterpretation of that idea as it frames out the drawing collection that I've curated. And I'll take you through that very, very briefly. First, dynamics. The normal pattern of observed changes to prevailing ecosystem conditions, functions, and their related ecological structures. Dynamics are inevitable and to some extent unpredictable. But operational dynamics and choreographies also extend to design landscapes in entire cities. They hint at the blurring, overlap, interdependence, and full hybridization of environmental and urban systems. Here you can think of the scoring of pedestrian and human movements analytically or projectively, the productive alignments of bird and bee behaviors with building and flood-scale infrastructures. The movements of wastes and resources and pollution and water across large metropolitan harbors, and inventive ways to record and project the movement of individual agents, digital particles across real and fictional topographies, together form an expanded array of ways in which the world is constructed and depicted from a movement, performance, and operational standpoint. This image, it's hard to read the labels here, is from Tredici, who's in the second row here. Second, succession, a process by which one ecosystem community is gradually replaced by another, which usually leads to communities more diverse in their structures and functions. Here, increasing complexity often brings along with it decreasing levels of control and varying degrees of possibility. Plant seeding, growth, and seasonal cycles can be activated in ways that create value for a project in its multiple formats over time. Habitat cultivation and diversification become the engines of project evolution and phasing. Linear trajectories of time and process and history expand the issues and inputs considered germane, and ecological infrastructural productive sequences are choreographed to suggest multiple possible futures. Emergence, the phenomenon characteristic of complex systems, and in particular patterns observed in nature, patterns that arise through the collective actions of many individual entities and a multiplicity of their interactions. Collectivity and multiplicity predominate, whereby multiple internal protocols and external inputs interact and inform the reconceptualization of landscapes and infrastructures at a range of scales. Individual agents play ongoing roles in existing and proposed landscapes and cities. Hydrologic, ecological, and jurisdictional mechanisms intersect and play off one another, often muddying the waters. The life and seasonality of protected metropolitan infrastructures and the crafting of humid and thermal atmospheres are all part of an understanding of the world in an eternal state of becoming. Resilience, the ability of an ecosystem to withstand and absorb the effects of sometimes unpredictable and sudden changes to prevailing environmental conditions, while still maintaining the majority of its structures and functions. Here, creative instabilities are invoked, and multiple states of being are possible even within the same territory. Piscine occupation of dissimilar ecological space, horticultural occupations of varying geologic and hydrologic territories, the mapping and projection of fluctuating urban and hydrologic choreographies, appropriation of four-dimensional modeling techniques that simulate and project reciprocal growth and flow strategies, and the design of places and cities that can have very distinct and very different futures, yet still demonstrate their formational principles, are all brought into play. Finally, adaptability, the capacity to respond to ecosystem dynamics and the resulting changes that normally occur in any living system, the capacity for learning and transformation. Here, an ongoing set of prompts, interventions, triggers, renew or redirect processes in action. Design has agency and intention in the act of redirecting, but in no way is it fully controllable. The mechanics at work are autonomous and independent. In this way, the designer becomes a producer or curator of effects, of dynamics, and a whole range of social, environmental, and urban conditions. Behavior in response to temperature, the careful and interactive staging of construction processes and growth mechanisms, training and management practices that spur new independent ecologies, the collusion of hydrologic and social agendas, emergent practice models, lifespan and project renewal processes, coordinated maintenance operations and administration regimens are all activated in the broader project of design thinking. But what now? The Projective Ecologies project importantly points forward, offering many departure points as the project of ecology is updated, reformulated, and superseded. On the one hand, Nina Marie reminds us that more testing of successional ecologies in situ is needed. Few extended large-scale demonstrations exist, especially in urban settings. Such basic work here could inform or inflect the models and theories we're currently using in ways we might not expect. Now, recently, new modeling programs and visualization techniques offer other paths forward for exploration and experimentation. Flow modeling, scripting, and processing software, in particular, offer time-based platforms for representing and programming change and evolution. In the book, Frances Wesley and Catherine McGowan provide insights from the social sciences on the ways in which messiness, non-linear, experimental, and sometimes chaotic processes of iteration, discovery, and feedback can advance problem solving and collaborative initiatives in multiple realms, including governance, business, and design. Sean Lally's essay on energy identifies new territory for exploration in which the performative aspects of design are pushed to modulate microclimates and energy flows, and thereby create new logics for design, as well as new vocabularies about atmospheres, gradients, intensities, and washes that can supplant ecologically derived categories of thinking. And Sanford Kwinter, in a synopsis of his keynote lecture from the conference, speculates further, broadening the context for our expanded understandings of ecology to plumb the anthropologic realms, with reference to theories developed by Jacob von Uexküll and Richard Wrangham. Kwinter opens up new worlds for discovery and testing that include human physiology, human and animal ethology, and social environmental relations. But these are mere beginnings. The bigger project initiated by the volume is to better and more critically understand both the context for and the implications of the various relationships that have developed between ecological and design thinking. The longer-term goal, of course, is to inspire all of you, our audiences, to turn the page and move forward. And in many ways, this is the project and the challenge ahead, to develop new frameworks for thinking, new synergies and cross-fertilizations among disciplines, and new ways of designing within the dynamic living world. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Chris. We have a little bit of time in this format, and I know that you're very comfortable sitting on the cookies, but again, I'll invite you to join us at the table. Plenty of perfectly serviceable furniture down here. I know that it's a busy time of year, it's a busy day, a lot of things going on, so if you have to step out, please do so. But before opening to your questions and a more free-ranging conversation, I wanted to just take a moment to probe a little bit. The first question is kind of simplistic, but this is the definitive cover color? Is this what we're going with?
This is what we're going with.
I think it looks great, but I've seen a couple of different versions of it in beta.
It's the first time I saw it this morning.
I see. And so your range of options was constrained by, we have the book, congratulations, and it looks fantastic. All right, so just staying for a little bit, staying for a minute with respect to the intellectual project, because we will get into the weeds shortly, presumably, but you said something I thought very early on, and it's in there, it's in the DNA of the project, but I wanted to draw you on because you hadn't said something about it in the talk, which had to do with a sense of anxiety or danger or threat. That is, what's the downside? What's the threat? What's the anxiety? What's the concern for our field, or for your audiences, if ecology becomes a metaphor for all things?
Well, I mean, in very simple terms, if it's everything, it's nothing. I remember a conversation, in fact, that Marie and I were having, and it was over a book project that she had been asked to contribute to, I think called Design Ecologies or something similar to that. I said, well, that sort of sounds interesting. What is that? She said, well, I can't really tell. And in fact, they ultimately rejected my paper, which I thought was odd, given that she's one of the more informed ecological thinkers who's thinking much more broadly than simply the natural sciences. And it had come to a point where just anything you can talk about is being called ecology. Now, there was an interesting project here with the Ecological Urbanism conference and exhibit, which very deliberately tried to broaden that discussion again, to take into account sets of thinking, bodies of knowledge that move beyond the kind of natural sciences core. And I thought that was quite useful. And yet we were running into this moment when simply, it was becoming a buzzword. And we wanted to kind of step back a little bit, think more deeply about the question, put on the table a couple different ways of thinking about this and then speculate on what we might do.
Part of what I found so persuasive about Hight's piece in the book, and it's also evident in the introduction and the talk that you just gave, is that it's on the one hand, it's a framework that has been abused through overuse, granted. At the same moment, Hight's formulation of epistemological framework strikes me as self-evident. It's impossible to imagine the last 4 decades absent this epistemological framework in a range of disciplines. That doesn't necessarily presuppose anything for our little corner of the university. But the combination of that epistemological backstory, combined with the fact that in design culture broadly, the idea of it being both an operating system, a way of viewing the world, and a way of proceeding through a set of design considerations, I think produced a condition for us in which we have to respond to that. That was my sense of urgency since 2010 has been, if we don't put this in play on our own terms as a field, then I think there is an enormous danger. So I tend to agree with your assessment of that. The first time that this became, for me, a pressing issue was actually before the conversation we had in 09-10. Just before that, I had occasion to give a talk to an audience of landscape architects where I said something self-evident in my own mind along the lines that, well, we could certainly begin with the postulate that nature is a cultural construct. Nature's a human invention. And as I launched into my second paragraph, of course, the hands went up immediately and said, well, hold on, what do you mean there? And I think, of course, we are comfortable, many of us, and increasingly so, expecting our audiences to come from a range of disciplinary and professional points of view. On the one hand, we know that there are those of us that come from a science paradigm. We think of ecology, landscape ecology in particular, as applied natural science. At the same moment, we know that ecology has never had a greater ascendancy as it enjoys studying in design culture. And at the same moment, it's also this epistemological framework. So in that context, the other experience that is kind of seared into me is I've been increasingly been invited to conferences in which designers and ecologists and planners are invited to talk to one another. And I'm not sure why this is, but the planners always get the first day, and the ecologists present their work, and the planners present their work. And the conclusion of almost all of the environmental and ecological planning talks is the need for more study sites. We need more data. We need more information, which of course is the scientific method, right? We need increasing bodies of knowledge. We need data with which to make models of the world to then falsify, right? The second day, inevitably, design and talking heads like myself are always on the second day, and we basically conclude with, we're going to China on Tuesday, give me help now. The world's going to hell and we need your advice. And the ecologists at this point are freaked out because it hadn't occurred to them at that moment that we were a part of the problem and we were in fact agents of urbanization. And in that regard, I find that this is really a very healthy moment, in part to simply ventilate all of those kind of simmering, lingering concerns and anxieties. It's certainly timely in the context of our searches in ecology and technology. And so in that regard, again, I want to draw you out on something you posited up front, but I want to hear you say more about, which is, do you really believe that scientists and designers can get along and understand each other?
Well, in some ways, the book speaks to that. I mean, having Nina Marie as a co-editor, co-contributor on the volume, I think very deliberately tries to start to create conversation and discourse between and among these disciplines. Going into the conference, I wasn't sure what we were going to get. And in fact, I wasn't sure how defensive various participants in the conference might be. But it was really, again, Stuart Pickett who started to kind of build a bridge for discussion. He wasn't the guy I expected to do it, because in some ways, some of his position has been, we're the ecologists, we do the natural science research, we give you the facts and data that you then use to take out into the world to design something. And in fact, it was in the panel discussion afterwards that he posited this idea that actually there is this common language that we have. There is this common activity that we have. Because they can't experiment with an ecosystem in the lab, or really in real life, it's the way that ecologists and designers both think, construct models of the world through drawing, and then go out and test those models, both within the kind of framework of the model that they're developing, and then occasionally out in the world. And I think he created this place for discussion and exchange. And I think it's partly the project to forward that invitation, if you will, as the book project rolls out.
Very good. We have the better part of a half an hour, and I want to spend most of that time in conversation with you and your thoughts and questions. So to the extent you have things on your mind, questions you have for Chris, along the lines of Gary.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. I'd like to extend Charles's last question really, and hear you out a little bit more. First of all, it's really impressive, Chris. In particular, I'm taken with your situating this current way of thinking about ecology in, let's say, almost a history of science of the last 40 years. It's fantastic. And culture, really. And today I think I took something extra special away from Forman's role in the way, as you characterized it, as proving really that movement through systems would be a game changer in the overall panoply of the ways that ecology is being thought. And you see very little of that in the card.
Right.
And then you begin to see it in the 90s. My question, which I'll try to broaden out a little bit, is about reception. How do you anticipate this would be received in the science side? It's just trying to build a little bit on Charles's point here, but a lot of people in the room have only seen a world where ecologists and landscape architects work together. But the world before that was something like a place where if you were to try to get a project approved in a town or a city, it was likely that if there was an ecologist in the room, he or she was on the regulatory side of the table, right? We've had this conversation quite a few times, telling you why your intervention was a bad idea. And I think among your lists, I can't remember if you stated it, but disturbance ecology, along with landscape ecology, have really changed the picture for us, because every act of design is an act of disturbance, you know? If it's only about taking out the Norway maple trees, that is going to cause a disturbance in a system, right? So every time we design something, we're involved in disturbance. I think science has largely taken on to, this idea has taken hold, but deeper inside the departments of science, how do you see this work being received?
It's a good question, and it's something that Lena Marie and I have talked about at length. I mean, certainly in some very straightforward ways, by putting forward essays by people in the scientific community, historic and contemporary, we're trying to establish a lineage, and frankly, trying to establish some legitimacy in terms of being specific, thoughtful, deep about the kind of research piece of it that we're putting on the table. And so that's part of it, I think. The other part of it is a bit harder, and we've really talked at length about how to use the book now to further engage those audiences. How is it? It's easy for us to kind of understand, well, you know, we know where to put this in terms of design audiences, we know how to get the book reviewed, we know places to go to give talks and all that sort of stuff. The question on the other side is how is it that we can use this as a new starting point for a conversation. And we do that in the practices and the work that we do simply by bringing folks on very early in the process and by talking to them over and over again and allowing ideas to build and reverberate through individual collaboration. That's been the best way, I think, to date that we've been able to do that. But there is some skepticism among the scientific community about how possibly could the ways that designers think inform the research, if the research is, you know, based on facts. And so I don't have an answer to that question, but it's one of the things that we want to probe in the coming year as we take this out, and not just focus on the design audiences, but look at the other, not just natural sciences. We're interested in social anthropology, we're interested in the business communities, as well as business thinkers in terms of how they work. And so we've set the table broad and hope to continue to engage that for the coming year.
And you implied, I mean, Gary sort of implied a generational shift or some kind of history in which I think certainly my professional career, I've seen an enormous shift in the ways in which the work of landscape architects and their ecological consultants are received. And it is true, there has been a very particularly clear formation of the ecologist as advocate for. And for me, I would say on the one hand, if all the project does is impact design and planning, then well, fantastic. You know, we have a lot of work to do there already. But what you said resonated for me with something that Erle Ellis has said recently. So, a visiting member of our faculty, Maryland, Baltimore County landscape ecologist, is also a contributor to the book. And Erle Ellis has suggested that there's really a generational shift going on in his field. And there's continually, of course, a very interesting fault line between the, you know, let's say, you know, properly credentialed academicians in the canon of science and those that are more doing the kind of applied landscape ecology that you and others enjoy the services of. And that fault line between, you know, the academy, science as an institution building project, and those that are, you know, engaged in the making of work is a really interesting one right now that obviously we need to spend more time. What else?
I noticed that Christina walked in. This is Christina Antiporta, who's been hard at work with me for the last year on this. I gave you a great rousing thank you before when you weren't here. Just wanted to publicly acknowledge that.
I think you said that you had worked harder than anyone else. Is that what you said?
It's true. It's true. To the point where your thesis advisor is giving me a hard time. What else?
Chris, one of the ecologists who made an impact in the post-Carson world was Barry Commoner. In his book, The Closing Circle, had this impact of bringing into the political discourse. Partly he ran for president as an ecologist who ran for president, which was a changing thing back in the day, in the 70s. He's somewhat famous for having formulated the 5 laws of ecology, the first of which was everything is connected to everything else, which obviously has design implications. And the last, although that it grew, was everything is constantly changing. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how your own practice in some of these projects here deal with this phenomenon that everything is constantly changing.
Well, it's funny in some ways, as we're collecting these amazing drawings that you've seen are in the book, it allowed me to put together some things that had impacted my thinking over the last 20 years. So. But I've got to say, I'm done with the arrow diagram at this point. I think we've exhausted its potential. So in that way, the book project has pushed me into thinking, you know, what are the other modes of working that we can start to engage? 4-dimensional, software-based, those sorts of modes of animation, even video, that we can use to start to inform and underpin the work. And so that's an explicit kind of immediate reaction that comes out of this. Came about last summer, where it just said, I'm done. These drawings are beautiful, but we're done. We've got to be done.
That's the one that's on the cover of the book.
Well, that's one of them. This one, Tomas Folk was really doing the work on. But you saw many others. I just think we need new ways of thinking about this. How else? I don't know. The book just arrived today. I haven't stopped to think about anything in the last couple of days, but I'll certainly start to now.
So I appreciate also that you rightly, put on the table the relationship between ecology and the political. It's inconceivable, the design field, architectural culture, absent the biopolitical in the last decade. And in that context, certainly there's more to be said, both at the kind of practical level of green politics and elected office, but equally with respect to what does it mean for a generation to have identified as advocates for to see ecology as a way of viewing the world as really a political, ethical statement. And now that we're increasingly awash in green claims, increasingly also buoyed by a cultural construct in which most people self-identify as advocates for the natural environment. What does that do relative to the identity of the people that are embedded here? So it's certainly an interesting set of questions. Anybody else? Fine.
I'm like, you don't mind. Somewhere between the spring plague of the GSD and the allergies coming, I've lost my voice. But I remember you one time saying something about we're reaching a way, instead of giving a definitive site plan for a project or a definitive final state of the proposal, that you are engaging in scenario building or various possibilities we can do. And that's somewhere in between having sort of an indeterministic, open-ended solution to the project, and on the other hand, having a project that is completed in a certain state. And I'm wondering if is that sort of that bridge, from ecological thinking to design thinking, where you never at the end of the day come up with a completed master plan or site plan, but a series of scenarios that then you pick from. Could you perhaps say something about that? Because I remember that resonated a lot with you when you said it.
Yeah, certainly. It's a way of thinking that I think started to impact me and the design work that I was doing starting from the 90s. And this idea that we needed to get away from things that were so fixed and so sculptural only, that were more about the sculptural form. And so through my education, the folks I studied with, like Corner and others, through the work that we've tried to do at Stoss, the idea has been, how do you set up a set of principles, right? How do you set up a kind of ground for action, if you will? How do you set up the rules of engagement, but also, how do you set up the catalytic forms that you use to engage dynamic processes, whether they're ecological, social, or otherwise? And I think equally in this discussion, to begin to develop schemes that are all about process without real physical form, I think is as big a mistake as doing the opposite. But the idea here was always to look at that engagement. How can a continued series of insertions or rearrangements or reworkings of a project begin to sort of allow that project to take on a kind of new life. So on the one hand, we might be involved in that as a curator, but others and other factors might allow to be part of that dance as well. I think some of the work in the book shows that. This idea of kind of recalibrating certain processes, even to new ecological ones.
That's where the shortcoming of the diagrams come from, because they never become planned. There's successional diagrams, something versus the scenario builder, we end up having to draw a plan that is meant that has precision to it.
In that regard, Bud, I think it's a timely question. It's an important question for the project as well. That on the one hand, I think our field grew exhausted years ago of the kind of fetishized open indeterminacy, kind of ad infinitum indeterminacy and openness, kind of exhausted itself intellectually. Right? And at the same moment, I think for Chris and Marie to take that impetus, place it in an historical context, right? To place it into a genealogy that says, yes, these ideas were important 10 years ago, and they ran their course, and at the same moment, ecology persists as a significant and important driver, both intellectually and in terms of project making. And so a part of the work that the project is doing, both in the conference and also in the book, is to have documented and described a moment that was quite productive a decade ago, and in some ways is a part of the history of the field now, but to situate it in a way that makes a useful history of it that's available going forward. In that context, that also, of course, has to do with Mosen and others' aspirations for an ecological urbanism. Right? I mean, if Mosen, as he has argued, that ecological urbanism is a continuation of the landscape urbanism project, but by more precise terms, and that's a sentiment that I've shared with him as well, then I think we do have to become more precise about those terms, actually, and not just assume that they can persist and be static. And in that regard, I guess I also find myself thinking, and it's also implied in your question, a little bit about the pedagogic implications. And I don't know if you have any appetite or interest in that line of questioning, but I just wanted to make a space between now and when we end in a couple of minutes for an opening about, well, what does this suggest for the line of work that we're doing in the academy? What does this suggest for the teaching of landscape architects or planners? But before we get to that, there's a question back here.
Hi. It's actually sort of related to that, stemming from earlier. But, I'm really interested in the question of research, which I think kind of leads into what you're talking about pedagogy and how we learn, how we produce work in our field and how we research in our field. And, I think that's one of the points where the difference and the difficulty in communication between landscape architects or architects, designers, and scientists come. And that it's very clear to me, I came into this with a degree in science, and it was very clear to me that what is thought of as research, here, compared to what is thought of as research in the science field, scientific fields, is very, very different and not very easily applicable. The scale and time frame of research in science is, as you suggested, very different from what we're kind of geared towards doing and able to do in the same time frame of the project. So I'm curious just to hear thoughts about kind of that problem, really. It's sort of an open-ended thought more than a question, I guess.
Well, certainly, I think one of the things that's of interest here is that as designers, we have a set of tools that we use, we have a set of techniques, we have an ability to actually graphically communicate. And the book does show ecologists' ideas about how to communicate as well, but it's interesting that even there, we felt it necessary at a certain point, not just me, but Nina Marie Lister as well, to redraw, to reinterpret, to rework some of the simpler drawings that ecologists have been using, and to explore them in different ways, in ways that I think only a set of designers could. So I think there's something about the ways in which we work that impact the ways in which we think, that can impact the ways in which research is carried out. I think engaging with that discussion is certainly something that's ripe for the doing.
Yeah, it's certainly a timely question, and it's exactly where I had hoped to get the conversation to go in part. on the one hand, there's a formulation that's attributed to Carl Steinitz, and he was referring to another context, or the context of the academy and practice. And I wasn't in the room when he said this, but it's been told to me by enough of my colleagues that I trust must be likely to be true. In which he said, basically, what's the relationship between the academy and practice? That they're fundamentally different industries. And there's something so wonderfully Steinitzian about that, the clarity of it, that just kind of appeals to me. And so my own sense has been, you know, if you're engaged in the sciences, if you're producing knowledge about the world so as to make it falsifiable, so as to create a better model, and then research is the production of data to inform that model-making and falsification process, on one level, I think we have to acknowledge a kind of fundamental, not incompatibility, but a fundamental difference of aim. You know, I mean, designers and planners are about intervention in the world. And so while we deal with similar sites and subject matter, I think we approach it often with fundamentally different epistemological frameworks. And in that regard, I guess a part of my own sense has been that in many contexts in our field of landscape architecture, in many design schools on many campuses, the scientific model has been given a preferred position. It's the high ground. Right? And at the same moment, the burden of proof almost always lands on our school to say, well, what the hell are we doing? And in certain moments in time, certain design schools have been perceived in major research universities to really be engaged in questions of taste culture. You know, I like blue, those are nice shoes. When I go to meetings on campus with a multidisciplinary group of faculty as we're kind of chit-chatting around lunch, often the conversation will turn toward fashion because they think that that's a way to engage with us. And fair enough, I don't want to, you know, completely preclude that line of conversation given where the design school has been and is going, but in that context, there's some instinct that I have to simply say right up front that we are approaching the same world but from fundamentally different goals. And within that, the secondary, the corollary to that has been, at least in my experience of landscape architecture over the last 2 decades, in many contexts, maybe less so here, but in many contexts, the presumption has been that landscape architecture should be the application of things that are scientific truths. That's the principle of landscape architecture, is to apply in the world what science has wrought. And underneath that is a kind of lingering geological determinism, not to say an ecological determinism, and there's a long history of that. It certainly predates ecology and landscape architecture. It goes back to the origins of environmental planning, really, in which the expectation, the presumption is that our business is about taking scientific knowledge and applying to reorganize the world in the favor of that light of science. And I don't want to preclude that possibility, but I think one of the things that the project does, one of the things the book does, one of the things the conference does, is it places that ambition in a more plural field. And so in that regard, I think of the project a little bit like postmodern colleges, actually. It's like, well, yeah, of course you can have your positivist science, of course you can. But you also have to understand the table's getting kind of crowded with positions and different plural points of view, not just political positions, but in fact fundamentally different ways of approaching the world. And I think at this point, intellectually on a campus like this, we would have to acknowledge in the postmodern era that it's very difficult to argue that a scientific way of understanding the world necessarily has a preferred position over all of the other ways of knowing the world that are available around campus. Although clearly here the word on this campus has had a certain privileged position over time, and the sciences have, of course, as well. In that context, a part of the ambition, I think, of the book is to simply normalize the idea that, on the one hand, philosophy, on the other hand, natural science, on the one hand, design, on the other hand, art history. All of these are ways of knowing the world that are valuable in research universities. I think we've got time for one more.
There's at least 3 names that I haven't heard. And one is Eleanor Ostrom, who, if you mention Garrett Hardin, you should always mention Eleanor Ostrom because she's the person who got Hardin to back down on his definition of tragedy of commons. The other one is John Codd, the ecological designer, and it's specifically in A Safe and Sustainable World, the book written by his wife Nancy Jacktodd, there's an elucidation of his ecological design principles, which I think are really deep and very, 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 very rich. And the third is James Lovelock. And over the weekend, there was a little piece in The Guardian, a little video piece in The Guardian, of him being interviewed as he's exploring exposition of his work at a museum in London. And one of the things that he said was, we shouldn't be saving the world. We should be like our nearest analog, the termites and the ants, who build their cities, their homes, so that they're self-regulating. And I know that there's at least one building in Harare, in Zimbabwe, which is built on the method of the self-regulating air conditioning that termite mines have. So I'm wondering about those three names, those three people, and those three ideas.
Well, I'll say that the third is somebody that I know and I've heard of. I don't know personally, but the other two I don't know. And I will say the project in the book does not claim to be the exhaustive study of these issues. In fact, what we try to do is trace very specific trajectories of thought. And certainly there's more in the book than I've been able to talk about today. So there are many more extensions to other folks that are doing research in the natural sciences and the humanities and design that you will find in the book. But again, ours wasn't to say, well, we want to just simply focus on the historical aspect of this in a very exhaustive way and do it in terms of creating a big text on anything that you can think of relative to this set of topics. We were as interested in identifying what are the multiple informants to a way of thinking that might then allow us to open up the discussion again, rather than to kind of say, okay, this is it and this is what we agree with. So in that way, it was very important not to even try to be that exhaustive. But I do acknowledge that there are going to be other ways of thinking through this set of issues, and I'm happy to engage those as we move forward.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Two brief, again, programming notes. So again, tomorrow evening, Tuesday the 15th, 6:30 in Piper, Jim Horn giving a kite lecture. The following Friday, the 25th, we have a colloquium here in Stubbins, 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. on ecological engineering, for those who are interested in that topic, so please come on. Thanks very much, Chris.
Great, thank you.